It started with a growl, not the kind you hear, but the kind you feel in your bones, like the air itself has teeth. We were in the middle of a diplomatic mission on Goran 7, one of those planets nobody talked about until someone discovered it was crawling with sentient life and natural resources worth more than a Terran moon. The Terran Alliance had sent a small team to negotiate, observe, and, if needed, bribe their way into an alliance with the dominant species on the planet. What we found was something no amount of training, tech, or treaties had prepared us for. They were called the Dravari. 9 feet tall, covered in charcoal black fur with slits of glowing amber for eyes, and claws that could slice through composite armor. Apex predators. The kind of creature that made you instinctively reach for a weapon, even if you were unarmed. Which most of us were, under the diplomatic clause. They didn't speak any known language when we first landed. No translator implant could make sense of their vocalizations. But we quickly realized they understood us, maybe not our words, but definitely our intent. That didn't make it easier. The first meeting was in what they called the Sky Cradle, a high cliff that overlooked a canyon filled with what we would later learn were nesting grounds, cavern dens lined with stone, moss, and the unmistakable scent of predator musk. The ambassador, a woman named Sarah Halden, made all the right moves, open palms, slow steps, lowered eyes. Even then, the Dravari leader, a scarred titan named Vierak, looked one flinch away from gutting her. And then there was me. I wasn't even supposed to be on the surface team. I was the comms tech, Merrick Wren, lowest rank specialist in the entire crew manifest. I was only planetside because the lead comms officer got food poisoning from a misidentified fruit. Lucky me. While Sarah was trying to establish dialogue, I stood back adjusting my portable relay pack. I kept glancing toward the canyon dens. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. It was instinct, the same tug you feel when you hear a baby cry, even if it isn't yours. But these weren't babies. These were cubs. I saw them, smaller, softer versions of the Dravari. Still big by our standards, but with eyes less jaded and movements more curious than cautious. They didn't growl. They chirped, clicked, and watched us from the shadows like half daring us to come closer. I made the mistake of smiling. Later, people would say that's when everything changed. Dravari don't smile. Not unless they're about to kill something. So when I grinned at the little one peeking over a stone ridge, several of the adult predators turned sharply. One even hissed low, causing our entire delegation to freeze. I remember Sarah shooting me a look that could have turned bone to dust. But Vierak raised a single clawed hand, and the pack stilled. Then, one of the cubs stepped forward. Just 2 feet. Just enough to make it clear he wasn't scared. He chirped again. This time at me. I blinked, unsure. Then, slowly, because every instinct screamed not to, I knelt. And that's when something unexpected happened. The growl that had filled the canyon since our arrival vanished. Not paused. Not softened. Gone. Complete silence. And then Vierak did something no one predicted. He walked over, not to Sarah, not to our top-ranked diplomats, but to me. He loomed, sniffed the air, and then let out a sound like a rock slide whispering. Later, our translator implants would catch up to the nuances. But even then, I understood the intent. You smiled at my blood. I nodded. Why? I didn't have an answer that sounded strategic or intelligent. So I gave the only one that felt real. Because he looked curious. Not dangerous. Vierak stared at me for a long time, then turned to his pack and said something that made several of them hiss, growl, or recoil. Then he gestured. And the cub came closer. Our delegation nearly panicked. The protocol officer whispered into my earpiece. Step back. Step back now. But I didn't. I waited. The cub approached, sniffed my hand, then nudged its head under my palm like a dog begging for scratches. So I gave him one. That was the moment our mission veered off every predicted curve. Later that day, Sarah pulled me aside. Her voice was sharp, urgent. You just became the most important piece of leverage we have. I was just... Don't. You made contact. Peaceful, voluntary contact. No predator species in recorded history lets an outsider near their young. Whatever just happened? It rewrote the playbook. I thought they'd send me back to the shuttle. Instead, I became part of the core diplomatic team. Not because of my expertise, God knows I didn't have any, but because the cub, who Vierock later introduced as Shokai, kept following me. And wherever Shokai went, so did the pack. And wherever the pack went, they tolerated our presence. That night, we camped closer to the dens than anyone had ever dared. The translators finally caught up with more of the language, and Sarah began real talks with Vierock. But the elders of the Dravari weren't happy. Many of them saw our presence as blasphemy. Their word translated to something like bloodless invaders. Their culture was bound by a sacred law. The blooded protect the young. The outside corrupts. I learned later that touching a cub without a ritual was punishable by death, even among their own. Which meant Vierock had not just broken a rule, he'd shattered a foundation. Tensions rose fast. I could feel it in every glance, every low growl. Some of the younger Dravari started walking perimeter patterns at night. Armed. Watching us not like guests, but threats. And through it all, Shokai kept showing up. Sneaking into our tents, stealing ration bars, curling up beside me like a wolf pup with a favorite scent. I didn't push him away. But I should have realized, this couldn't last. By the end of the third day, the situation hit a wall. A senior elder named Torkan, massive and grizzled, confronted Vierock in front of the entire canyon. From the edge of the sky cradle, they bellowed in their growling language, our translators struggling to keep up. Torkan accused him of weakening the bloodline, of exposing the cubs to outside contagion, of betraying the way. Vierock's only reply was, he smiled. To which Torkan roared, then let him prove his blood. That sentence echoed through the stone and trees like a battle horn. Sarah whispered, what does that mean? I didn't know. Until Vierock turned to me and said, you will enter the Vale tomorrow. If the cub follows, he is yours. If he does not, you leave. What's the Vale? I asked. Vierock stared at me, unblinking. Where prey becomes predator, or disappears. That night, as I sat by the embers of our low-heat fire, Shokai crawled into my lap and chirped softly. He didn't know what was coming. And truthfully, either did I. But one thing was clear. If I entered the Vale, I wouldn't be walking out the same. If I walked out at all. It wasn't the kind of forest that whispered. It was the kind that waited, quiet, watchful, filled with the heavy breath of something ancient. At dawn, I stood at the edge of the Vale. No map. No compass. No escort. Just me, and whatever test the Dravari considered worthy of blood and legacy. Shokai was perched atop a ledge behind me, his eyes bright with something I couldn't name, maybe fear. Maybe loyalty. Maybe something older. Vierock had laid the terms. If the cub entered after me, it would be his choice. If I tried to coax him, the trial would be void. If I returned without the cub, I would not be permitted near any of them again. Worse, Sarah implied, it might fracture our entire peace negotiation. Still, I had no idea what the Vale actually was. It's not a place, Vierock had told me. It's a test. The Vale changes depending on who walks into it. Cryptic. Terrifying. I took my first step past the black-rooted trees, through a curtain of hanging vines that shimmered with condensation. Behind me, the cub chirped once, but didn't follow. Not yet. My boots sank slightly into the moss-covered path, and the temperature dropped fast, too fast. Breath fogged. The canopy above tightened. Light became a rumor. Sounds faded. For 10 minutes I heard nothing but the crunch of leaves and my own pulse, thudding too loud in my ears. Then the first scream hit. Not human. Worse. It was that high-pitched, glass-shard screech predators make when something has gone wrong. My instincts screamed to run. But I didn't. Not because I was brave, but because the second I stopped, I realized the moss wasn't under my feet anymore. It had moved. I looked down, just in time to leap back from a section of ground that uncurled like a tongue and hissed. A living camouflage predator, some kind of burrow-dwelling serpent, snapped at the space where my foot had been. Its maw glistened with translucent spines. I scrambled back, hard hammering, drawing the only tool I'd brought, a compact multi-beam torch. "Back!" I shouted. The thing didn't understand English. But it understood light. The beam flared into its eye cluster, and it hissed again, recoiling just enough for me to scramble into thicker underbrush. Not exactly heroic. But I was alive. The veil wasn't just about danger. It was about disorientation. Every direction looked the same. The trees were gnarled, growing in corkscrew patterns, and the bark absorbed sound like foam. The deeper I went, the less I trusted my senses. I walked for what felt like hours. My ration bar tasted like dust. The water pouch was half gone. I started hallucinating shapes in the mist, eyes that blinked, voices that murmured in languages I'd never heard. The veil played tricks on you. Then I saw him. Shokai. He was standing just beyond a ravine, on a fallen log. He had followed. But he wasn't alone. 2 other cubs stood beside him. Older, leaner, eyes glowing with an eerie blue sheen. They looked like they belonged here. He looked like he was trying to. One of them hissed. Shokai stepped forward. They blocked him. I got it then. This was his trial too. They weren't just guarding him. They were testing him. Seeing if he would abandon me, the outsider, to remain safe within their pack. "Shokai," I said quietly. He looked at me. It wasn't a look of panic or distress. It was a question. I didn't answer it. I couldn't. My hands stayed at my sides. My torch remained clipped. This had to be his decision. One of the older cubs snarled, a low, rattling sound. They lunged, just a feint, but Shokai didn't flinch. Instead, he chirped something low and sharp. Not aggressive. Defiant. Then he stepped off the log. Down the incline. Toward me. And the others didn't stop him. They just watched. And vanished into the mist. When Shokai reached me, he butted his head against my hip. I breathed out for the first time in what felt like an hour. But the veil wasn't finished. The real trial hadn't even started yet. We heard it before we saw it, branches cracking. Ground thudding. Something big, fast, and wrong. I turned. Through the fog came a shape, taller than Vierak, bulkier than any Dravari we'd seen. But its fur was patchy, sickly gray. Its eyes didn't glow, they burned blood red. It was moving wrong, like its joints didn't agree with gravity. Shokai froze. The thing let out a sound that shattered whatever silence the veil had been holding onto. Not a roar. A challenge. It wasn't a Dravari. Not exactly. But it had once been one. "Run," I said. Shokai didn't move. Then it charged. I did the only thing I could. I grabbed the torch and flared it full power into its face. It blinked, staggered. I scooped Shokai into my arms. He was heavier than he looked, and bolted through the brush. Vines whipped at my face. Something cracked behind me. The creature was fast, too fast. I turned sharp at a bend. Bad idea. I slipped. We tumbled down a slope, landing hard in a shallow stream. Shokai yelped. I rolled to shield him, mud filling my ears. The thing landed at the top of the slope and didn't pursue. Not immediately. It just waited. Watching. Then it began circling, using the slope, the fog, the veil itself. Trapping us. I checked Shokai. No major wounds. But he was shaking. Terrified. I pulled out a flare from my emergency belt. Only one. Not meant for defense, just location marking. Then I remembered Vierak's words. "You smiled at my blood." That wasn't a metaphor. It was a bond. I looked Shokai in the eyes. "We fight together. You understand?" He blinked. Then nodded. The moment mattered. Because when the thing lunged down the slope, Shokai leapt sideways, baiting it with a chirp and feint. I struck with the flare, jamming it into the creature's shoulder. It screamed, this time in pain. The flare lit its fur like oil. It didn't stop. But it faltered. I grabbed a shard of its own cracked claw from the ground, a remnant of some previous fight, and jabbed it upward as it lunged again. The shard went deep into its neck. The creature reeled, thrashed, and finally collapsed. Steam hissed from its wounds. Shokai stepped back beside me. And then I heard something new. Drums. Not from machines. From the trees. Dozens of amber eyes opened in the canopy above. The Dravari had been watching. All of them. They'd seen the decision. The fight. The bond. Vierock dropped down from above, landing like a shadow incarnate. He looked at the burned corpse, then at Shokai, then at me. He spoke once. He followed. And the others answered in unison. He chose. They formed a circle, not to judge, but to witness. Shokai walked to the center, stood on his hind legs, and let out a cry that shook the trees. A cub no longer. Vierock turned to me. You entered the veil without weapon or promise. I nodded. You emerged with blood and fire. I didn't want to fight. Which is why you were worthy. He stepped closer. Reached out one claw. And marked my shoulder with a slash, not to wound, but to brand. The cub is yours. Not as property. As kin. Shokai chirked and pressed against me. I realized what had happened. I hadn't passed a trial. We had passed each other's. The sky over Gorinth 7 cracked open 3 days later. It wasn't a storm. It was something far worse. We had returned from the Vale, me, Shokai, and the Dravari who had watched the trial in silence but now looked at me with something new in their gaze. Not suspicion. Not hostility. Recognition. Vierock had invoked the rite of flame, a sacred tradition so ancient it didn't even translate into words, only symbols. It meant I was no longer outside. I was now chosen blood. Sarah, upon hearing it, didn't know whether to laugh or panic. You realize what this means? She asked me quietly that night. No, I said. I barely understood the rite. They cut my shirt and gave me this. I glanced down at the jagged claw scar across my collarbone, still smoldering with healing salve. This branding. It means you're now part of their clan, she whispered. And more importantly, you've bound our mission's success to your survival. That should have been a warning. I didn't know that far above, circling the planet's exosphere, a military command cruiser named TAS Resolute was running out of patience. The diplomats in orbit weren't impressed by ancient rites or spiritual bonds. They were there for one reason: resource access. And when our check-ins started getting sporadic after I entered the Vale, someone higher up flagged the mission as compromised. A fallback protocol was triggered. Operation Terraform Override. Or, in less bureaucratic terms, force the locals into compliance by staging a defensive show of strength. We didn't know it at the time, but drones had already been deployed. Low-orbit kinetic strikers. Small, fast, and impossible to detect by primitive sensors. They weren't supposed to hit anything. Just skim treetops. Shake the ground. Intimidate. The problem? The Dravari didn't intimidate. They retaliated. When the first kinetic rods cracked open the canyon wall and pulverized a clutch of nesting dens, it didn't take long for the blood to follow. Shokai's nest was spared by luck. Others weren't. By the time we reached the impact site, the bodies were still warm. Tiny ones. Cubs that had chirped at me only days before. The morning was silent. Then Vierock howled. The sound was unlike anything I'd heard from him before. Not rage. Not pain. Grief. The kind that split mountains and burned down histories. And suddenly I wasn't standing among allies anymore. I was standing among warriors preparing for war. Sarah tried to re-establish comms with the Resolute. No reply. The command ship had entered blackout mode, scrambling frequencies to avoid ground interception. Probably thought we were already dead. But we weren't. And now the Dravari thought it was our doing. Shokai stayed close to me, but even he began to look confused. Torn. I was the outsider again. Worse, I was the outsider whose people had brought death. Vierak approached me, slow and heavy. He looked down at the claw mark on my chest. You are chosen, he said. I am, I answered, voice steady. Then explain why your Skyblades have murdered our young. I can't, I said. But I will find out. And I will stop it. Words, growled Torkan, the elder who had opposed me before. Blood for blood. Enough, Vierak snapped. But even he didn't sound certain anymore. Sarah turned to me, teeth clenched. We have one option. We get to the uplink spire. The mountain relay? I asked. Yes. If we boost a manual override, we can reach Resolute and cancel the fallback. It's halfway up Mount Shook, I said. Then we start climbing. It wasn't just me and Sarah. Shokai insisted on coming. So did Vierak. And, to my surprise, Torkan. Someone must witness truth, the elder grunted. We moved at dusk. The path was steep, wet, and riddled with tremor fissures from the kinetic strikes. The climb was brutal. Shokai handled it like a ghost, for limbs gripping crevices with natural grace. Vierak moved like a shadow. I wheezed. Sarah wasn't faring much better. Halfway up, the clouds thickened. A low rumble shook the spire. Another drone run? I asked. Vierak paused. No. That is no machine. He was right. Above us, slicing through mist and lightning, was something not deployed by Resolute. Something native. A flying predator. Massive. I caught only a glimpse, serpentine wings, a jaw like a bone scythe, and eyes that shimmered with the same amber hue as the Dravari. Sky Talon, whispered Shokai. Torkan hissed. Veil-bound. Cursed. Then why is it here? Sarah asked. Vierak didn't answer. Because he didn't know. It wasn't part of the plan. And plans were breaking apart fast. By the time we reached the summit, the relay was already active, but not ours. A beacon was transmitting. Encrypted Terran code. My comms implant buzzed. Specialist Ren. Priority override detected. Stand by for tactical extraction. Wait, what? A cold, synthesized voice filled my earpiece. By order of High Command, ground team has exceeded operational window. Full spectrum pacification begins in 6 minutes. Pacification. That wasn't a warning. That was a kill order. I turned to Sarah. They're going to bomb the entire canyon. No, she said, voice cracking. Not without protocol review. Not. They're blacking it out. Shokai's ears twitched. He knew something was wrong. Vierak had moved to the edge of the cliff. What do your stars say? That we're all dead unless I shut down that signal. I muttered. I rushed to the beacon array. My fingers worked fast, bypassing manual locks. It was Terran tech, but just barely. This wasn't an official relay. It was a contingency node, planted without our knowledge. A Trojan failsafe. Sarah joined me, rerouting circuits. We have 30 seconds. Shokai growled. Look! The clouds pulsed. Shapes were descending. Not drones. Weapons. Orbital rods. 10-meter tungsten lances falling at terminal velocity. The kind that turned jungles to ash and stone to mist. I had no choice. I yanked the power cell. The relay sparked, then died. The beacon cut out. For 2 seconds, everything stilled. And then, the rods curved. Not struck. Curved. I watched in awe as they adjusted mid-fall, redirecting into the empty valley beside us, harmlessly slamming into a dead basin. Kinetic clouds mushroomed. The mountain shook. But we lived. All of us. Then I noticed Shokai's eyes. They were glowing. Not amber. Blue. The same eerie sheen the older cubs had. He had triggered something. A signal? A shield? No. Something deeper. Vierak saw it too. He has the gift. Torkan looked at me. So do you. I blinked. What? The bond. It changed you. They didn't mean biologically. They meant something older. Cultural. Spiritual. Somehow my presence, my survival, my choices, had activated a dormant part of Dravari ritual. A convergence. The sky talon shrieked above. And it landed. Right beside us. It didn't attack. It bowed. Not to Vierak. To Shokai. And Shokai stepped forward. And bowed back. Vierak dropped to one knee. So did Torkan. Sarah whispered. What's happening? A new bloodline, Vierak said. A bond beyond tribe. Beyond species. Then he looked at me. You are no longer chosen. I swallowed. Then what am I? You are kin. The sky talon stayed with us until dawn. It perched silently on a stone outcropping above the relay tower, wings folded like sails, eyes unblinking in the fire-washed night. Nobody dared approach it. Not even Vierak. Not even me. Shokai sat beside me on the cracked stone, his head resting on my thigh. He hadn't said a word since the rods fell, just breathed slow and deep, like his entire body was recalibrating. Maybe it was. I couldn't stop looking at him. He was still the same cub who had chirped at me on that first day, who'd curled up inside my tent, who had howled beside me in the vale. And yet, he wasn't. Something inside him had changed. And not just because of me. The gift. They called it that like it was a legend, a whisper passed from ancestors to cubs when the fires burned low. A bond between soul and soil, blood and sky. A convergence that hadn't happened in centuries, perhaps never between species. But it had now. And it had chosen us. At sunrise, the sky talon spread its wings and launched into the mist without sound. Not a screech. Not a farewell. Just gone. Sarah stood beside me as the light broke through the clouds. Her voice was hoarse, exhausted. The Resolute stood down. She said, Your shutdown flagged their override fail-safe. They're calling it a tactical restraint incident. Nobody's being court-martialed. Yet. That's good, I said. She glanced at Shokai. And what about him? I paused. I think we should be asking him that. We returned to the canyon that afternoon. The Dravari did not cheer. They didn't sing or chant or gather in celebratory circles. They stood. Thousands of them. Lined along the ledges, cliff tops, ridges. A wall of fur and fang in silence, watching as we entered. I held my head high, my pulse a steady riot. Shokai walked beside me, no longer padding or slinking. He walked like a leader. At the center of the canyon, Vierak waited. He knelt, not to me, but to the cub. Shokai, born under the stone eclipse, tested in the vale, marked by fire and shadow. He rumbled. What is your will? Shokai turned to me. Not for approval. Just acknowledgement. Then he stepped forward and spoke a single phrase. I stay with the human. The silence broke like ice under pressure. Gasps. Growls. And then, voices. Agreement. Not all. But enough. Torkan stepped forward and raised his claws toward the sky. Then it is done. A bloodline outside of blood. A path not of the way, but of the new. Vierak looked at me. He will remain with you, Merrick Wren. Not as your charge. Not as your cub. But as your equal. I swallowed. And what does that mean, exactly? Vierak smiled. Really smiled. It means everything changes. The next weeks passed in a blur. We didn't leave Gorinth 7. Not immediately. Not ever for me. Sarah negotiated new terms with the Alliance. No longer extractive. No resource mining. The Dravari were granted co-sovereign protectorate status under Article 12 of the Cross-Species Concord. A first. Not just for Gorinth, but for any species we'd ever contacted with claws longer than a man's forearm. The veil was declared a sacred preserve. All future contact required approval from the new council, a joint tribunal made up of both Dravari and Terrans. And me? I stayed. I helped build that council. Shokai sat beside me through every negotiation, every ritual, every impossible meeting between worlds that should have never touched. He learned to speak in Terran dialects. Not fluently, but enough to make his will known. He learned fast. Observed everything. And I learned too. Not just their customs or survival methods, but how they thought. How they passed down knowledge through dream hunts and memory scars, how they mapped the world not with charts, but with feeling. It wasn't navigation, it was navigation by ancestry. And slowly, our languages began to blend. A new Creole emerged between cubs and human children. Yes, children. Because eventually, more humans came. Not soldiers. Not diplomats. Families. Teachers. Caretakers. Children who played near the dens, guarded but unafraid. Dravari cubs who learned to make Terran snowballs in the ashfields, who exchanged growls with giggles. And they didn't just tolerate each other. They bonded. It wasn't perfect. There were tensions. Not everyone wanted peace. Some humans thought we'd surrendered our power. Some Dravari believed we'd diluted their way. But something had started that could not be undone. Something older than fear. Something deeper than alliance. A bond. Between predator and human. Between blood and choice. 5 years later, I stood at the sky cradle again. Older. Scarred. A little slower. Shokai stood beside me, no longer a cub. Taller than me now, his mane streaked with streaks of silver, his eyes calm and unreadable. Remember the first time we stood here? I asked. He didn't answer right away. He rarely spoke unless it mattered. You smiled, he finally said. I chuckled. You growled. I was hungry. You tried to eat me? No, he said, tilting his head. I wanted to understand why you weren't afraid. I was. I just didn't let it decide everything. He nodded. A silence fell again. But it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Below us, children, human and Dravari, were running through the lower paths of the canyon. No guards. No weapons. Just curiosity and bare feet and claws. I've been offered reassignment, I said. Shokai turned to me, unblinking. They want me to help on another planet. A new species. A tougher negotiation. And will you go? I hesitated. I don't know. He looked at me for a long time, then said, You do not need to prove yourself again. I laughed. Maybe not. But maybe someone else needs that smile. He didn't argue. Because he understood. On the day I left Goran 7, the sky was clear. Shokai walked me to the shuttle pad. So did dozens of others, elders, cubs, teachers. Sarah had returned years ago, but still sent letters. The Sky Talon hadn't returned. Not physically. But the stories had. As I stepped into the ship, Shokai reached out one claw and tapped my shoulder where the old scar still sat. I will tell them your name, he said. Will they believe it? No. But they will listen. That was enough. The ramp closed. The world shrank beneath me. And I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because somewhere out there, another world was waiting. Another species that didn't yet know they could bond with something as strange as a human. And maybe, just maybe, another cub would look up someday, see a stranger smile. And smile back.